The Western Canadian Arctic is a geography defined by restraint. Land and sea merge beneath ice for most of the year, their boundaries erased by cold and distance. Banks Island lies far above the tree line, a low and wind-scoured mass of tundra bordered by shallow, frozen seas. For much of the 19th century, it existed only as a shape on incomplete maps, rarely visited and poorly understood. In winter, darkness settles for months at a time. The sun drops below the horizon and does not return, leaving the landscape lit only by moonlight and aurora. Temperatures remain well below freezing. Ice thickens across the water, locking bays and channels into stillness. Movement becomes difficult, then nearly impossible. In summer, the change is brief and partial. Ice breaks but does not disappear. Leads of open water form unpredictably, then close again without warning. Fog rolls in from the sea, obscuring landmarks and compressing distance. Sound carries strangely in the cold air. It was into this environment that HMS Investigator entered in the early 1850s. At the time, there was nothing remarkable about the silence that surrounded her. The Arctic was already quiet. It had always been so. By the middle of the 19th century, the Arctic had become a place of unresolved absence. In 1845, Sir John Franklin departed England with two ships, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, tasked with completing the Northwest Passage. They were last seen by Europeans in Baffin Bay. After that, no confirmed contact followed. Years passed without word. The British Admiralty responded with a sustained search effort unprecedented in polar exploration. Naval expeditions were dispatched from both the Atlantic and Pacific approaches, intended not only to locate Franklin's crews but also to map unknown coastlines in the process. These missions were structured, methodical, and driven by official urgency rather than individual ambition. HMS Investigator was assigned to one such expedition. Commanded by Captain Robert McClure, she sailed as part of a western approach through the Bering Strait. The plan was indirect. By entering the Arctic from the Pacific, the expedition aimed to trace the northern coast of North America eastward, closing gaps left by previous voyages. The mission was not framed as a rescue in the immediate sense. Years had already passed since Franklin's departure. Survival was uncertain. Still, the Admiralty maintained that evidence, records, routes, or remains, might yet be found. Each ship sent north carried the weight of that expectation. For Investigator, the search for Franklin defined her purpose before she reached the ice. What awaited beyond the charts was not yet known. The Arctic had not begun to resist. That would come later. HMS Investigator was a mid-sized wooden vessel adapted for polar service. Her hull had been reinforced to withstand pressure from sea ice, and her interior modified to carry provisions for extended isolation. She was not built specifically for Arctic exploration, but altered for it, following the Royal Navy's established practice during that period. Captain Robert McClure, a career naval officer, commanded the expedition. He had previous experience in Arctic waters and was regarded as methodical, if rigid, in temperament. His orders were explicit: proceed eastward along the Arctic coast, search for signs of Franklin, and document navigable channels where possible. The ship's complement included officers, sailors, and marines, drawn from standard naval service. Few had prior experience in extreme polar conditions. Their training was naval, not exploratory. Discipline, routine, and hierarchy defined daily life aboard the ship long before ice would dictate it. Provisions reflected contemporary understanding of long-duration voyages. Salted meat, ship's biscuit, preserved vegetables, and lime juice were stored in large quantities. Coal and timber were carried for heating. Clothing was wool-based and heavy, adequate by the standards of the time, though limited in insulation compared to later polar. Equipment. There was no expectation of extended entrapment. The Arctic was understood as difficult, but passable in seasons. Ice was considered an obstacle to be navigated, not a force capable of holding a ship for years. When Investigator sailed north through the Bering Strait in 1850, the crew did so under conventional assumptions. The ship entered the ice not as a vessel already endangered, but as one still moving forward. In the summer of 1851, HMS Investigator moved eastward along the northern coast of what is now Alaska and into the waters north of Banks Island. Progress depended entirely on the condition of the ice. At times, narrow leads of open water allowed cautious advancement. At others, the ship lay still for days, surrounded by unbroken floes. McClure pressed on whenever movement was possible. Charts were incomplete, and the coastline offered few reliable reference points. Soundings were taken regularly to avoid grounding in the shallow Arctic seas. Each mile gained was recorded carefully, part of the broader mandate to map the region as thoroughly as conditions allowed. As the season advanced, the character of the ice changed. Floes thickened and packed more tightly together. Winds shifted unpredictably, driving ice against the hull and closing passages that had been open only hours earlier. The ship's reinforced structure absorbed the pressure, but movement became increasingly restricted. By early autumn, the opportunities to escape diminished. The sun sank lower each day, and temperatures dropped steadily. New ice formed rapidly in open water, sealing the ship's position. Attempts to maneuver free became shorter and less effective. Eventually, they ceased altogether. HMS Investigator came to rest in Mercy Bay on the northern coast of Banks Island. The anchorage offered limited shelter but no clear route out. As winter set in, ice consolidated around the hull, binding the ship in place. The decision was no longer active. It had already been made by the season. The point of return passed quietly. There was no single moment of alarm, only the gradual recognition that the ship would not move again that year. The Arctic had closed. With the ship fixed in Mercy Bay, preparation replaced movement. The crew shifted from a voyage mindset to one of endurance. Sails were furled and secured. Snow was cleared from the deck to reduce weight and prevent uneven pressure along the hull. Ice anchors were set to stabilize the ship against shifting floes. As daylight shortened, internal order became essential. Living quarters were reorganized to conserve heat. Stoves were installed below deck, fueled by coal and supplemented with wood scavenged from the ship's stores. Ventilation was controlled carefully to limit condensation, which froze quickly on interior surfaces. The onset of polar night brought extended darkness. For weeks at a time, the sun did not rise above the horizon. The crew relied on lamps and candles, their light limited and functional. Time was measured by routine rather than observation. Watches were kept, meals prepared, and duties assigned as they would be at sea, despite the ship's immobility. Health was monitored closely. Lime juice was issued to prevent scurvy, in accordance with Royal Navy practice. Diet remained largely unchanged from that of the voyage, consisting of preserved rations supplemented occasionally by fresh meat when hunting was possible. Muskoxen and Arctic fox were taken in small numbers near the ship, providing both food and a break from confinement. Morale was addressed through structure. McClure enforced discipline, believing order essential to survival. Reading, lectures, and limited physical exercise were encouraged. The crew adapted to the cold incrementally, layering clothing and modifying habits to reduce exposure. Outside the ship, the environment remained static and silent. Ice extended in every direction, unbroken and unmoving. Inside, life continued in measured intervals. The winter did not arrive suddenly. It settled in, and remained. By the second year, confinement had become normal. The crew of HMS Investigator operated within a narrow physical and psychological boundary defined by the ship and the ice around it. Movement beyond Mercy Bay was limited and purposeful, undertaken only for hunting, surveying, or maintenance. Daily routines were formalized. Watches were kept even though the ship remained stationary. This structure preserved a sense of continuity with naval life and helped regulate sleep and labor during prolonged darkness. Meals followed fixed schedules. Equipment was inspected regularly, despite minimal use. Physical survival depended on restraint. Fuel was rationed to extend heating capacity through the winter months. Clothing was repaired rather than replaced. Tools were reused and adapted for unfamiliar purposes. Snow was melted for water, a task requiring constant attention to fuel consumption. Exploration did not cease entirely. Sledge parties traveled short distances during periods of relative stability to chart the surrounding coastline and confirm the ship's position. These journeys were slow and taxing, limited by temperature, visibility, and physical endurance. Each return reinforced the reality of isolation. Mental discipline became as critical as physical preparation. The absence of external change blurred time. Days passed without visible difference. To counter this, officers organized lectures and instructional sessions. Men were assigned tasks that had little immediate necessity but preserved routine and engagement. Despite these measures, strain accumulated. Minor illnesses lingered longer than expected. Small injuries healed slowly in the cold. The confined environment magnified disputes, though records suggest they were managed through established hierarchy rather than confrontation. The ship remained intact. Provisions, while diminishing, were sufficient. There was no immediate crisis. Survival continued not through decisive action, but through repetition. Each day resembled the last, marked only by the gradual wearing down of reserves. As the second winter approached, it became clear that HMS Investigator would not be released by seasonal thaw. The summer of 1852 had brought only limited movement in the ice. Brief openings formed offshore, but none connected Mersey Bay to navigable water. The ship remained fixed, her hull held fast by ice that showed no sign of retreat. Adaptation shifted from temporary adjustment to long-term management. Provisions were recalculated with greater caution. Rations were reduced incrementally to account for the possibility of another year without relief. Hunting continued when conditions allowed, though success was inconsistent and dependent on weather and animal movement. The crew's physical condition began to change. Despite preventive measures, symptoms of scurvy appeared in several men. Swelling of joints, fatigue, and weakness were recorded in medical logs. Lime juice supplies were limited, and their effectiveness diminished over time, likely due to storage degradation. Medical treatment relied on rest and diet modification, both constrained by circumstances. The ship itself required constant attention. Ice pressure damaged external timbers and fittings. Repairs were conducted in freezing conditions, often with bare hands to maintain dexterity. These efforts were slow and physically demanding, but necessary to preserve the vessel as a shelter. Psychological endurance was tested by repetition and uncertainty. The expectation of release each summer had structured earlier planning. With that expectation now uncertain, motivation became harder to sustain. Formal routines continued, but their effectiveness weakened as outcomes remained unchanged. Attrition was gradual rather than sudden. Men were not lost to dramatic events, but to cumulative decline. Illness reduced labor capacity. Fatigue extended recovery times. The margin for error narrowed steadily. Still, the crew persisted. Records indicate no collapse of order. Survival continued through controlled adjustment, even as the limits of that control became increasingly apparent. By late 1852, the physical toll of extended confinement was unmistakable. Scurvy, frostbite, and malnutrition affected more crew members. Weakness limited their ability to perform routine tasks, and minor injuries became serious over time. The medical officer documented fatigue, gum disease, and persistent joint pain, all consistent with long-term vitamin C deficiency and cold exposure. Provisions, though rationed carefully, were decreasing at a steady rate. Ship's biscuit hardened further with age, salted meats lost palatability, and the stored vegetables had long since deteriorated. Hunting supplemented supplies but remained unpredictable. Muskoxen or Arctic fox were present only seasonally and in small numbers. Ice conditions and weather restricted sledge travel, further limiting access to fresh food. The monotony of ice and darkness compounded the physiological strain. Weeks could pass without meaningful change in the environment. Daylight returned briefly in the summer months, but the visible horizon offered little assurance of escape. The psychological weight of uncertainty, how long they would remain trapped, whether rescue would ever arrive, remained constant. Logs note quiet concern and meticulous record-keeping rather than panic. Despite these conditions, the crew maintained essential duties. Heating stoves were tended continuously, water melted from snow, and ice pressure against the hull was monitored. Boats and sledges were prepared for potential relocation. Every task, no matter how small, was treated with deliberate care to ensure continued survival. Time became measured in rations and routine. The horizon remained unchanged. The environment imposed a static, relentless pressure. For the men aboard Investigator, survival was now as much about endurance of circumstance as it was about active effort. By the spring of 1853, it had become clear that HMS Investigator could not be freed from the ice through natural thaw. Prolonged entrapment had caused gradual deterioration of provisions, worsening health among the crew, and increased pressure on the hull from surrounding floes. Captain McClure faced a decision forced by circumstance rather than choice, to abandon the ship and attempt escape over the ice. Preparations for evacuation were methodical. Sledges were ready to carry men and supplies. Boats were stripped of non-essential items and reinforced where possible. Rations and tools were distributed carefully to balance immediate need against potential duration of the journey. Clothing and bedding were allocated to maximize protection from cold and wind. The journey across the ice began in small, organized groups. The crew moved cautiously, testing the stability of the frozen terrain and monitoring weather conditions. Progress was slow, measured in miles rather than days. Each day required repeated assessment of ice thickness, snow drift, and crevasse risk. Survival depended on calculation, not speed. Physical condition influenced movement. Men weakened by scurvy or frostbite required assistance from others. The medical officer recorded exhaustion, pain, and slowed gait, but no sudden catastrophes. Loss of life during the trek appears minimal, though the strain on the crew was extensive. Each day blurred into the next under identical cold and light conditions, with progress marked only by position on the map. Eventually, the crew reached a location where contact with another expedition became possible. They were taken aboard the relief ship sent by the Admiralty, completing the evacuation with minimal external incident. HMS Investigator, abandoned, remained locked in the ice of Mercy Bay, a stationary witness to the years spent in isolation. The evacuation from HMS Investigator marked the final phase of the crew's ordeal. Travel across the frozen expanse to the relief vessel required continued vigilance. The men moved deliberately, balancing urgency with caution. Ice conditions remained unpredictable, pressure ridges, thin leads, and concealed cracks necessitated careful route selection. Navigation relied on simple tools and observation. Compass bearings, sextant readings when the sun appeared, and landmarks provided orientation. Travel was slow, constrained by the physical limits of weakened men and the necessity of hauling sledges laden with remaining supplies. The team maintained cohesion, ensuring that no individual was left behind, while minimizing exposure to wind and cold. Encounters with local wildlife were rare but documented. Tracks of polar bears or Arctic foxes were noted, though actual interactions were limited. Hunting supplemented meager rations only occasionally, and most calories were derived from remaining ship stores. Every step demanded energy conservation and attention to environmental hazards. Upon reaching the relief party, the crew was transferred aboard in orderly fashion. Medical attention was administered for scurvy, frostbite, and exhaustion. Records describe weakness, pale complexions, and reduced stamina, but no immediate fatalities during the final approach. Men were quiet, disciplined, and largely silent about their experiences. The journey ended without dramatic rescue fanfare. The ship, the ice, and the Arctic landscape remained impassive. Survival had been achieved through careful planning, endurance, and the strict maintenance of routine under unchanging and unforgiving conditions. HMS Investigator remained in Mersey Bay long after the crew departed, frozen into the Arctic landscape. Over time, the ship became part of the environment it had endured for years, a silent marker of isolation and resilience. The Arctic itself showed no acknowledgement, unchanged and indifferent to human passage. The significance of the expedition was documented in Admiralty reports and naval logs. McClure and his crew had completed the first known traversal of the Northwest Passage, though not entirely under sail. Their survival provided empirical knowledge about Arctic conditions, ice behavior, and the limits of human endurance in polar environments. Artifacts left aboard the ship, observations recorded in meticulous logs, and the mapping of previously uncharted coastline contributed to broader understanding of the region. The experience illustrated the necessity of preparation, discipline, and adaptation in extreme isolation. The expedition's outcome was neither heroic triumph nor tragic disaster, it was the measured result of endurance under relentless environmental constraint. The Arctic remained quiet. Snow drifted over the hull. Ice pressed silently on the frozen bay. In the absence of movement, the region continued as it always had, carrying forward only the traces of those who had passed through. Survival, in this context, was recorded quietly, in logs and charts, leaving no mark beyond the factual record of endurance.